many, you are considered a groundbreaker, a pioneer in the preservation of Tibetan literature. I'm wondering what drives you to make this your life's work.
I guess I was at the right place at the right time. The Tibetan literary tradition was endangered in 1959, and I ended up in India working for the Library of Congress, where we were able to help the Tibetans to preserve the books that they brought across the border. These were texts of all sorts of material, and there were texts already in India. So we encouraged them to publish them under a program called the Public Law 480. Public Law 480 allowed for the use of the proceeds of the sale of excess agricultural commodities. And during that period, we published over 12,000 Tibetan volumes. These were then purchased and sent to 18 libraries in the United States and eventually 5 in Canada.
How did you end up working for the Library of Congress in New Delhi?
I went out to India after having studied Tibetan in Seattle under a Ford Foundation and then later a grant from a number of other organizations, the Ford Foundation included. And while I was there, I decided I didn't know enough, so I wanted to stay on. So I got a job. I was there at the right time with the Library of Congress, working on cataloging romanization tables. We had to put Tibetan script into something that could be read by the computer. And so we had to work out a table so that each letter had something that could hopefully be turned back into Tibetan script someday.
So I assumed by that point in the early 60s we're talking, you already spoke Tibetan?
Yes. Fortunately, I had been at the University of Washington in Seattle, and there were 8 centers throughout the world where Tibetans were invited to come and teach us. This was in 1959, 1960, under a program of the Rockefeller Foundation. Only one was in the United States. The rest were in France, Germany, the UK, Norway, etc.
Now I have a funny question for you. I noticed you were born in Utah. Mormon, right?
Yeah.
And Mormons have an inclination for archiving.
I think so, yes. And there's a number of things about the Mormon faith that sort of interested me. One was the hidden treasures. The 3 Mormon holy books, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine of the Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, each have their parallels in the Tibetan Nyingma tradition. Joseph Smith discovered golden plates that had to be read with special spectacles and a breastplate. And all of this sounded so familiar to when I encountered this in Tibet, in the Tibetan tradition. I was in Seattle at a very fortunate time when the lamas came, and I had a little bit of Tibetan, very little, and I was asked to live with the family that had been invited by the University of Washington. This project produced a lot of very interesting side results. We were supposed to be learning strictly academic pursuits, but of course many of us got interested in the content rather than the subject.
You're quoted as saying that the study of Tibet is a special passion of yours. Why Tibet?
Back in the early days, it was the most useless thing I could think of.
Can you explain why?
Because in many families, the only things that are respectable are the military and science and the law. And I just decided I didn't want to really do any of that. I didn't want to go to West Point. And so I ended up wandering, and ending up at Seattle, where a new project was beginning, and it was interesting. And I started studying Mongolian and Tibetan and Turkish. In 1959, when the Tibetans fled, the Rockefeller Project, think, hey, this would be a cool thing to do, is to bring live Tibetans to teach in these 8 universities throughout the world. And each senior scholar went to India to select. His Holiness made recommendations as to who would go to which university.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or
Dalai Lama.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
So the University of Washington selected the Sakya Phuntsok Podang, which was a family of ancient religious heads, and the Sakya tradition dated back to the 11th century. Of course, when they got there, much of what we did had to be done from their memory. We didn't have books. No books were available. And so I was very fortunate that the lamas themselves could remember so much. But, we didn't have the things to use for footnotes. Western scholarship likes footnotes. So eventually I ended up in India, where I could go and try to find the books. And I just happened to be in India when the Library of Congress was working very diligently to build these libraries that could be used for scholars who were interested in Asia.
Just a side question, was there an original vision for this? Was there someone in particular who thought we have to preserve?
There were people like Horace Pullman at the Library of Congress. There was Congressman Dingell, who is really the author of the Public Law 480, which provided that these funds made from the sale of excess agricultural commodities could be used for producing scholarship and Americans who understood. And this wasn't just India. We had similar programs in Indonesia, Pakistan, Burma, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Israel, Poland, Yugoslavia, Egypt, because at that time America was doing much of feeding of the world. So the government established, under the Library of Congress, field offices that would collect newly printed books in all of these languages and catalog them. And Tibet was not part of it, but there were many people who spoke Tibetan-type languages in India and the border regions. Then Sikkim was independent, in Bhutan. These are areas that had a Tibetan culture. And so we began encouraging people to print books, and then we would purchase books, the newly reprinted books, in probably it was about 23 copies, because later on the Canadians did a very similar program called the Indo-Canadian Shastri Institute.
So in a way, your fascination with the uncovering a text proliferated there, right?
It did.
And almost like an Indiana Jones of India at that time, trying to look around for these specific texts.
Yeah, it was very exciting, and it also gave me access to some of the greatest Buddhist teachers of our time.
Have you always had, have you always had a love for ancient manuscripts?
Yes, I have.
How?
I don't know. It's just anything that's, they looked interesting to me. When as a child, I was very interested in Deringer's The Alphabet, and I tried to learn as many scripts as possible. I did similar things later when I moved from India to Indonesia, where I was interested in the previous, the Balinese, the Madurese. There were many different scripts in India that used to be used. Now, of course, everything is homogenized into Bahasa Indonesia. But I got interested in that. And then I went to Cairo. I got interested in the languages of the Middle East. So yes, I have been interested in funny books and funny scripts.
I'm trying to figure out this chronology. So you were in India, and then...
I was transferred from India to Indonesia, where I served 9 years. And then I went to Cairo. When I came back to the United States, I realized that all of the books that we had published were decaying because the paper that was used in the developing world was not acid-free. Many of the books that we had published in the 60s, by the 90s, were halfway or three-quarters of their way on to disintegration. Many of the books were printed with lithography, and the ink used on the ink stones, or the stones, ate holes in the paper. So I thought, well, it'd be a nice thing to do with the new technologies, which there were so many of them, to start publishing, not by paper, but by using the digital format. And we began to create scans, digital images, not input, but just take what the original text was. So that was how it began.